The Memoirs of Sergeant Bourgogne offer a personal account of his experiences during Napoleon's Russian campaign. He describes the harsh realities faced by the French soldiers. These are his words. I do not know how long I had been asleep when I was awakened by the horse, frightened in his turn by the howling of the wolves outside. Picard took a long pole, and tying some straw and resinous wood to the end, he lit it, and rushed on the animals, holding his flaming pole in one hand and his sword in the other, and for the moment they fled. He returned, triumphant, but he had scarcely lain down again when they came back with redoubled fury. He then took a great piece of lighted wood, and throwing it a dozen yards off, he told the Jew to take out a quantity of dry wood to keep up the blaze. After this, we heard no more howling. At about 4 o'clock, Picard woke me with an agreeable surprise. Without telling me, he had made soup with some oatmeal and flour he had left, and had roasted a good piece of horse flesh. We both set to with a good appetite. Picard had given the Jew his share, and we took care of the horse also. We had filled several wooden tubs with snow, which was now melted. We purified it by putting in a quantity of lighted charcoal. This served for our drink, for soup, and for watering the horse, who had drunk nothing since the evening before. After looking to our boots, I took a piece of charcoal and wrote the following inscription on the plank in large letters. 2 grenadiers of the Emperor Napoleon's Guard, lost in this forest, passed the nights of November 24th and 25th in this hut. The day before, they enjoyed the hospitality of a kind Polish family. This inscription I signed. We had scarcely gone 50 yards when our horse stopped short. Our guide said he thought he saw something on the road, and on going nearer there were 2 wolves sitting waiting for us. Picard fired, and the wolves disappeared. Half an hour afterwards we were safe. We first came across a bivouac of 12 men, German soldiers attached to our army. We stopped near their fire to ask for news. They looked at us without answering and then consulted among themselves. They were in the last stage of destitution. 3 dead bodies were lying near them. As our guide had now kept his bargain, we gave him what we promised him, and after asking him again to thank the good Poles for us, we bade him goodbye and a safe journey. He strode off quickly and disappeared. We now prepared to gain the high road, only 10 minutes walk off, when 5 of the Germans surrounded us, begging us to leave our horse behind to be killed and assuring us we should have our share. 2 of them took hold of his bridle, but Picard, who had had enough of this, said, in bad German, that if they did not leave hold of the bridle, he would cut their faces for them with his sword, and he drew it out of its sheath. The German took no notice, and Picard repeated what he had said. No answer. He then gave the 2, holding the bridle, a smart blow with his fist, which stretched them in the snow. He asked me to hold the horse, and said to the others, "Come on, if you have any pluck." Seeing, however, that no one moved, he took 3 pieces of meat out of the saucepan and gave them to the men. Those lying on the ground got up at once for their share. I saw that they were almost dead of hunger, and to make up for our rough treatment of them, I gave them a piece already cooked, weighing more than 3 pounds. They threw themselves on the food ravenously enough, and we continued on our way. A little farther on, we came on 2 fires almost extinguished. Several men, half dead, lying around them. 2 of them spoke to us. One cried, "Comrades, are you going to kill the horse? I only want a little blood." We did not answer. We were still a gunshot from the high road. When at last we reached it, I said aloud to Picard, "We are saved." A man near us, wrapped in a half-burned cloak, said, raising his voice, "Not yet." He moved off, looking at me and shrugging his shoulders. He knew what was going on better than I did. Soon afterward, we saw a detachment of about 30 men, engineers and pontonniers. I recognized them as the men we had met at Orsha, where they formed part of the garrison. This detachment commanded by 3 officers and which had joined us only 4 days ago, had not suffered. They looked strong and well and were traveling in the direction of the Berezina. I asked an officer to direct us to the Imperial quarters, and he replied that it was still in the rear but had begun to move, and that we should soon see the head of the column appear. He warned us to look well after our horse, as the Emperor had given orders to take all that were found for the use of the artillery and the wounded. While we waited for the column, we hid ourselves in the wood. I cannot possibly describe all the sufferings, anguish, and scenes of desolation I had seen and passed through, nor those which I was fated still to see and endure. They left deep and terrible memories which I have never forgotten. This was November 25th, perhaps about 7 o'clock in the morning, and as yet it was hardly light. I was musing on all I had seen when the head of the column appeared. Those in advance seemed to be generals, a few on horseback, but the greater part on foot. There were also a great number of other officers, the remnant of the doomed squadron and battalion formed on the 22nd and barely existing at the end of 3 days. Those on foot dragged themselves painfully along, almost all of them having their feet frozen and wrapped in rags or in bits of sheepskin, and all nearly dying of hunger. Afterwards came the small remains of the cavalry of the guard. The Emperor came next on foot and carrying a baton. He wore a large cloak lined with fur, a dark red velvet cap with black fox fur on his head. Murat walked on foot at his right, and on his left, the Prince Eugène, Viceroy of Italy. Next came the Marshal Berthier, Prince of Neufchâtel. Ney Mortier Lefebvre, with other marshals and generals whose corps had been nearly annihilated. The Emperor mounted a horse as soon as he passed, so did a few of those with him, the greater part of them having no more horses to ride. 700 or 800 officers and non-commissioned officers followed, walking in order and perfect silence, and carrying the eagles of their different regiments, which so often had led them to victory. This was all that remained of 60,000 men. After them came the Imperial Guard on foot, marching also in order. The first were the chasseurs. Poor Picard, who had not seen the army for a month, gazed in silence, but it was easy to see how much he felt. He struck the ground many times with the butt of his musket, then his breast and forehead with his clenched hand. Great tears fell from his eyes, rolled down his cheeks, and froze in his moustache. Then, turning to me, he said, "I don't know, Montpes, if I am awake or dreaming. It breaks my heart to see our Emperor on foot, his baton in his hand. He so great, who made us all so proud of him." He went on. "Did you notice how he looked at us?" The Emperor had turned his head towards us as he passed. He looked at us as he always looked at the men of his guard when he met them alone. He seemed, in this hour of misfortune, to inspire us by his glance with confidence and courage. Picard declared that the Emperor had recognized him, which was quite possible. My old comrade, fearful of looking ridiculous, had taken off his white cloak and carried it over his left arm, and although his head still pained him, he had put on his fur cap, not liking to appear in the sheepskin the Poles had given him. Poor Picard forgot all his own miseries, and now only thought of the Emperor and of the comrades he longed to see. At last the old grenadiers appeared. These were the 1st regiment. Picard belonged to the 2nd. We were not long in catching sight of them, however, as the 1st column was a short one. In my opinion, quite half were missing. When at last his own regiment came up to us, Picard advanced to join it. Then someone said, "Look, isn't that like Picard?" "Yes," answered Picard. "It is I, and I will not leave you again except to die." The company immediately took possession of him, for the sake of the horse, of course. I walked with him for some time longer to get a piece of the horse's flesh if they killed him, but a shout was heard. The horse belongs to the company, like the man. I belong to the company, certainly, said Picard. But the sergeant, who claims a bit of the horse, killed his master in the first place. Very well then, said a sergeant who knew me. He shall have some. This sergeant took the place of a sergeant major who had died the day before. The column came to a halt, and an officer asked Picard where he came from and how he happened to be in front, as those who had escorted the convoy had come back 3 days ago. The halt lasted for some time. Picard related his adventures, stopping continually to ask after several comrades whom he failed to see in the ranks. They were all dead. He dared not ask after his bedmate, who was also from his own country, but at last he ventured. "And where is Rougeau?" "At Krasnoe," said the drummer. "Ah, I understand." "Yes," continued the drummer. "He died from a ball which cut both his legs off. Before he died, he made you his executor. He gave me for you his cross, his watch, and a little leather bag containing money and different things. He begged me to tell you that they were for his mother. If, like him, you were so unfortunate as not to see France again, you were to commission someone else." The drummer, named Patrice, then took all the things out of his knapsack before all the company, saying to Picard, "I give them to you just as I received them from his hands." He took them out of his knapsack, which we replaced under his head, and directly afterwards, he died. "If I have the good fortune to get back to Picardy," said my friend, "I will carry out my comrade's last wishes." They began the march, and I bade goodbye to my old friend, saying we should meet again at bivouac in the evening. Then I waited by the side of the road until my regiment came by, as I heard it formed part of the rear guard. After the grenadiers came more than 30,000 men, almost all with their feet and hands frozen. A great number of them without firearms, as they were quite unable to make use of them. Many of them walked leaning on sticks. Generals, colonels, other officers, privates, men on horseback, men on foot, men of all the different nations making up our army, passed in a confused rabble, covered with cloaks and coats all torn and burnt, wrapped in bits of cloth, in sheepskins, in everything they could lay their hands on to keep out the cold. They walked silently without complaining, keeping themselves as ready as they could for any possible struggle with the enemy. The Emperor in our midst inspired us with confidence and found resources to save us yet. There he was, always a great genius. However miserable we might be, with him we were always sure of victory in the end. I had more than an hour to wait before the column had passed by, and after that there was a long train of miserable wretches following the regiments mechanically. They had reached the last stage of destitution and could not hope to get across the Berezina, although we were now so near it. Then I saw the remains of the young guard, skirmishers, flank men, and some of the light companies escaped from Krasnoe. All these regiments, mingled together, marched in perfect order. Behind them came the artillery and several wagons. The bulk of the artillery, commanded by General Negret, had already gone before. Next came the fusilier chasseurs. Their numbers were greatly diminished. Our regiment was still separated from me by some pieces of artillery, drawn by poor beasts with no power left in them. After that I saw my regiment marching to left and right of the road to join the fusilier chasseurs. The adjutant-major, Roustan, saw me the first and cried out, "Hallo, poor Bourgogne, is that you? We thought you were dead behind us, and here you are alive in front. This is first rate. Have you met some of our men behind?" I told him that for the last 3 days I had been in the woods to avoid being taken by the Russian. Monsieur Césaris said to the colonel that he knew I had stayed behind since the 22nd, and that he was surprised beyond everything to see me again. My company came at last, and I took my own place in it before my friends were aware of it. When at last they saw me, they came round me asking questions which I had not strength to answer. I was as overwhelmed to find myself once more amongst my comrades as if I had been with my own family. They told me they could not imagine how I had become separated from them, and that if they had only known I was ill and could not follow, it should not have happened. As I glanced over the company, I saw that their numbers also were terribly diminished. The captain was missing, he had lost all his toes by the frost, and just at that moment. They did not know where he was, although they had found a wretched horse for him to ride. 2 of my friends took hold of me under the arms, seeing that I could scarcely walk. We joined the Fusilier Chasseurs. I never remember in all my life having such a terrible longing for sleep, and yet we were obliged to go on. My friends supported me under the arms again, telling me to go to sleep. This we did for each other in turn, for sleep overcame us all. Frequently it happened that we stopped short, all 3 of us having gone off. The cold, fortunately, was much less that day. Otherwise most of us might have been frozen to death. In the middle of the night we reached Borisau. The emperor stayed in a country house on the right of the road, and the guard bivouacked round it. General Roguet, who commanded us, took possession of a greenhouse for the night. I and my friends were behind it. During the night the cold increased very much. The next day, the 26th, we took up a position on the banks of the Berezina. The emperor was at Studianka, a little village on a hill in front. We saw the brave pontonniers working hard at the bridges for us to cross. They had worked all night, standing up to their shoulders in ice-cold water, encouraged by their general. These brave men sacrificed their lives to save the army. One of my friends told me, as a fact, that he had seen the emperor himself handing wine to them. The first bridge was finished at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a painful and difficult piece of work, as the trestles sank continually in the mud. Marshal Oudinot's corps crossed immediately to attack the Russians who had tried to prevent our passage. The cavalry of the Second Corps had already swum across, not waiting for the bridge to be finished, and every man took a foot soldier behind him. The second bridge, for the artillery and cavalry, was finished at 4 o'clock. Directly we arrived at the banks of the river, I lay down, wrapped up in my fur, and then found myself trembling all over with fever. I was delirious for a long time. I fancied I was at my father's house eating potatoes, bread and butter à la flamande, and drinking beer. I do not know how long I was in this condition, but I remember my friend bringing me some hot broth in a bowl, which I drank eagerly, and I was soon in a perspiration in spite of the cold. Besides my bearskin cloak, my friends had covered me with a great piece of waterproofing that had torn off a wagon. The rest of the night I lay quiet without moving. On the next day, the 27th, I felt rather better, but terribly weak. That day the emperor crossed the Berezina with part of the guard and about 1,000 men belonging to Marshal Ney's corps. Our regiment remained on the banks. Suddenly I heard my name called. I turned my head and saw Monsieur Peignot, director of the emperor's stage posts and relays, who had searched me out. They told him that I was ill, and he came at once, not to give me anything. He had nothing to give except encouragement. I thanked him for his kindness and said I did not expect even to cross the Berezina or to see France again, but I begged him, if he were more fortunate than I, to tell my parents of my sad situation. He offered me money, but I declined it. I would willingly have exchanged 800 francs for the potatoes and bread and butter I dreamed I had eaten at home. Before he left me, he pointed out the house where the emperor had stayed, saying he had been unfortunate, as the house was a flour warehouse. But the Russians had taken it all, so that he had nothing to offer me. He shook me by the hand and left me to cross the bridge. As soon as he had gone, I remembered that he had spoken of some flower in the emperor's house, so I rose, and weak as I was, I dragged myself in that direction. The emperor had only just left the house, and yet he had already taken off all the doors. I went through several rooms, and the traces of flour could be seen in them all. In one of them, the boards in the floor were very badly laid down. There was more than an inch between them. I sat down and scraped out with my sword as much dirt as flour, which I collected and put into my handkerchief. After working more than an hour, I got out about 2 pounds in weight, an eighth of which was dirt, straw, and little bits of wood. That did not matter in the least. I went out happy. As I made my way towards our bivouac, I saw a fire, where several men from the guard were warming themselves. Amongst them was a musician from our regiment who had a tin bowl on his knapsack. I signed to him to come to me, and as he seemed unwilling to leave his place, I pointed to my parcel, making him understand there was something inside it. He rose with difficulty, and when he was near enough, I said, in a voice which the others could not hear, that if he would lend me his bowl, I would make some cakes which we could share. He consented directly, and as there were several fires near, we looked out for one in a quiet place. I then made a paste and 4 cakes from it. The half I gave to my musician and took him back with me to the regiment, still camped on the bank of the river. I divided the rest of the cakes with the men who had helped me along the road. They thought them very good, still hot as they were from the baking. After drinking some of the muddy water of the Berezina, we warmed ourselves, waiting for the order to cross the bridges. Near our fire was a man belonging to the company attired in full uniform. I asked him what that was for, and he only laughed at me. The poor fellow was ill. That laugh was the laugh of death as he succumbed during the night. A little further off was an old soldier with 2 chevrons, 15 years service, that is. His wife was cantinière. They had lost everything, carts, horses, baggage, besides 2 children who had died in the snow. All this poor woman had left to her was despair and a dying husband. The poor creature, still a young woman, was sitting on the snow, holding her dying husband's head on her knees. She did not weep. Her grief seemed beyond that. Behind her, leaning on her shoulder, was a beautiful young girl of 13 or 14 years, the only child remaining to her. This poor child was sobbing bitterly, her tears falling and freezing on her father's cold face. She wore a soldier's cape over her poor dress, and a sheepskin on her shoulders to keep out the cold. None of their own comrades were there to comfort them. Their regiment was utterly destroyed. We did all that we possibly could for them, but I was not able to find out if these unhappy people were saved. Whichever way one turned, these terrible scenes were taking place. All carts and wagons furnished us with wood enough to warm ourselves, and we made the most of this opportunity. My friends wanted to hear how I had spent my 3 days of absence. They told me on their side that on the 23rd, when they were marching across the forest, they caught sight of the 9th Corps drawn up by the roadside, shouting "Vive l'Empereur!" They had not set eyes on this corps for 5 months. These men, who had scarcely suffered at all and had never wanted food, were distressed at seeing their comrades' destitution. They could hardly believe that this was the Moscow army, then so splendid, now so miserable, and so sadly reduced in numbers. The 2nd Corps d'Armée, commanded by Marshal Oudinot, and the 9th by Marshal Victor, Duke of Bellune, also the Poles under General Dombrowski, had not been to Moscow, but had remained in Lithuania. For the last few days, however, they had been engaged against the Russians, had repulsed them, and taken a large quantity of baggage. As the Russians retired, they had burned the bridge. This was the only bridge over the Berezina and had stopped our advance, keeping us penned up between 2 forests in the middle of a marsh. We were a medley of Frenchmen, Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese, Croats, Germans, Poles, Romans, Neapolitans, and even Prussian. I saw some canteen men whose wives and children were in great despair, weeping. We noticed that the men seemed to suffer more, both morally and physically, than the women. The women bore their sufferings and privation with an astonishing courage, enough to reflect shame on certain men who had no courage and resignation to endure their trials. Very few of these women died, except those who fell into the Berezina in crossing the bridge, or some who were suffocated. We were quiet when night came. Everyone in his bivouac, and no one came to cross the bridge during the night of the 27th, 28th, a most astonishing thing. I slept, as we had a good fire, but in the middle of the night I was seized with fever again, and became delirious. The sound of firing woke me at about 7 o'clock. I got up, took my firearms, and without speaking to anyone, I went up to the bridge and crossed it alone. I met no one but the pontonniers, who camped on the two banks to repair the bridge in case of any accident. The first thing I saw when I reached the other side was a large wooden hut. The emperor had slept there and had not come out yet. I was shivering with fever, so went up towards the fire, where several officers were engaged in studying a map. I received such a cold welcome, however, that I hastily retired. One of our men, who had observed me, now came up to tell me that our regiment had crossed the bridge and was in the second line of battle behind Marshal Oudinot's course. As the cannon roared and the bullets came rattling over to where we were standing, I started off to join the regiment, saying to myself that I had better be shot than die of cold and hunger. So I walked forward into the wood. On the way, I overtook a corporal of my company, dragging himself painfully along, so we helped each other and arrived at the regiment together. There we saw a fire, and as the corporal was shivering with fever, I led him up to it. Hardly had we arrived, when a ball struck my poor comrade in the chest and stretched him dead at my feet. I could not help crying out, "Poor Marcelin, how lucky you are!" Just then the rumor ran that Marshal Oudinot was wounded. When the colonel saw one of his men fall, he ran to the fire. And noticing how ill I was, he ordered me to go back to the end of the bridge and wait for men who had not come up and bring them to the regiment. The greatest disorder prevailed at this place. All the men who had not taken advantage of the night to cross had thrown themselves in a mass onto the banks of the river as soon as they heard the artillery, in order to cross by the bridges. A corporal of our company, named Grosjean, who came from Paris, asked me with tears in his eyes if I had seen his brother. I said no. Then he told me that he had been with him ever since the Battle of Krasnoye, as he was ill with fever, but just now, by some dreadful fatality, they had been separated. Thinking he had gone on in front, he had been inquiring of his comrades on all sides and not finding him. He was going back over the bridge, for if he did not find him, he would die. Wishing to dissuade him from such a fatal resolution, I begged him to stay with me at the head of the bridge, where we should very likely see his brother as he passed. But the poor fellow stripped off his arms and knapsack, saying that as I had lost my own, he would make me a present of them if he did not return, and that there were plenty of muskets over at the other side. He then made as if he would go, but I stopped him. I pointed out to him the number of dead and dying already on the bridge, these last, preventing others passing over by catching hold of their legs and all rolling together in the Berezina. They appeared for a moment amongst bits of ice, only to disappear altogether and make way for others. Grosjean did not even hear me. Fixing his eyes on this scene of horror, he thought he perceived his brother on the bridge, struggling to clear a pathway for himself through the crowd. So listening only to the voice of despair, he climbed over the dead bodies of men and horses, which blocked up the way from the bridge and rushed on. Those he first met tried to thrust him back, but he was strong and did not give way. He succeeded in reaching the unfortunate man whom he had taken for his brother, but alas, it was not he. I followed all his movements with my eyes. Seeing his mistake, he redoubled his efforts to reach the further end, but he was knocked over onto his back on the edge of the bridge and nearly thrown into the water. They walked over his body, his head, but nothing vanquished him. He collected all his strength for a new effort to rise and seized hold of a cuirassier's leg, who in his turn got hold of another man's arm. The cuirassier, however, was hindered by a cloak over his shoulder. He staggered, fell, and rolled into the Berezina, dragging after him Grosjean and the man whose arm he held. They sank then, adding to the number of men underneath the bridge and on each side of it. The cuirassier and his companion disappeared under the ice, but Grosjean, more fortunate, had seized one of the supports of the bridge, against which he found a horse. Climbing onto the horse by his knees, he begged for help for a long time, speaking to deaf ears. Finally, some engineers threw him a rope, which he was clever enough to catch and tie around his body, and thus from one support to another, over dead bodies and lumps of ice, he was drawn over to the further side. I did not see him again, but I heard the next day that he had found his brother, a little distance off, but in a dying condition. Thus perished these two poor brothers, and also a third in the 2nd Lancers. When I got back to Paris, I saw their parents, who begged me for news of their children. I left them one ray of hope by saying that their sons had been taken prisoners, but I felt certain they died. While these sad events were taking place, the grenadiers of the guard, accompanied by an officer, went round the bivouacs, asking for dry wood to warm the emperor. Everyone willingly gave the best they had. Even dying men raised their head to say, "Take what you can for the emperor." By this time it might be 10 o'clock, and the second bridge, built for the cavalry and artillery, had just broken in under the weight of the latter. A number of men sank with it, and most of them perished. The disorder and confusion were thus doubly increased, for as everyone rushed to the other bridge, it became an absolute impossibility to get across. Men, horses, carts, canteen men, with their wives and children, were all mingled in frightful disorder, crushed against each other, and in spite of the shouts of Marshal Lefebvre, who stood at the end of the bridge to keep all the order possible, he could not remain there. He was swept on with the others, and forced to cross to avoid being suffocated or crushed to death. I had managed to get together 5 men of our regiment, 3 of whom had lost their firearms in the confusion, and I had ordered them to make a fire. I kept my eyes fixed all the time on the bridge and saw a man in a white cloak. He was pushed by those behind him and fell over the body of a horse, stretched on the ground. With extreme difficulty, he got up, staggered a few steps, fell again, rose a second time, only to fall again by our fire. He remained thus for a little while, and thinking that he was dead, we were about to lay him on one side and remove his cloak, when he raised his head and looked at me. It was the gunsmith of our regiment. He said sadly, "Ah, Sergeant, what misfortunes I have had. I have lost everything, horses, carts, all I had. I have only one mule left which I brought from Spain, and I have just been forced to leave him. I was carried across the bridge, but I nearly died." I told him that he would be very fortunate and ought to thank heaven if he got back to France alive. So many men now crowded round our fire that we were obliged to leave it and make another some little way back. The confusion and disorder went on increasing, and reached their full height when Marshal Victor was attacked by the Russians, and shells and bullets showered thickly upon us. To complete our misery, snow began to fall and a cold wind blew. This dreadful state of things lasted all day and through the next night, and all this time the Berezina became gradually filled with ice, dead bodies of men and horses, while the bridge got blocked up with carts full of wounded men, some of which rolled over the edge into the water. Between 8 and 9 o'clock that evening, Marshal Victor began his retreat. He and his men had to cross the bridge over a perfect mountain of corpses. On the night of the 28th-29th, It was possible for all the unfortunate wretches on the opposite bank to get across, but paralyzed by the cold, they stayed behind to warm themselves by the warmth of the burning wagons, which had been set on fire on purpose to make the men go across. I remained in the rear with 17 men and a sergeant named Rosière, led by one of the men, as he had become almost blind and was shivering with fever. I was sorry for him and offered to lend him my bearskin to cover him, but so much snow had fallen during the night that it had saturated the cloak. The snow then melted with the heat of the fire and dried up again. When I took hold of the skin in the morning, it was as hard as iron and useless for wearing, and I had to leave it behind. Wishing, however, to make it useful to the last, I laid it over a dying man. We had passed a wretched night. Many of the men in the Imperial Guard had died. At about 7 o'clock on the morning of the 29th, I went towards the bridge, hoping to find some more of our men. The unfortunate men who had not taken advantage of the night to get away had at the first appearance of dawn rushed onto the bridge, but now it was too late. Preparations were already made to burn it down. Numbers jumped into the water hoping to swim through the floating bits of ice, but not one reached the shore. I saw them all there in water up to their shoulders, and overcome by the terrible cold, they all miserably perished. On the bridge was a canteen man, carrying a child on his head. His wife was in front of him, crying bitterly. I could not stay any longer, it was more than I could bear. Just as I turned away, a cart containing a wounded officer fell from the bridge, with the horse also. They next set fire to the bridge, and I have been told that scenes impossible to describe for horror then took place. The details I had witnessed were merely slight sketches of the horrible pictures that followed. I was now told that the regiment was moving. I made the men take up their arms and counted them to the number of 23, without the gunsmith. As the regiment moved off, each man joined his company. We were at last on the march. It might be perhaps 9 o'clock. We crossed the wooded piece of ground interspersed by marshes, which we traversed by means of bridges made of pine wood, fortunately not burned by the Russians. We waited now and then for those in the rear to come up with us. The sun was shining, and I sat down on Grosjean's knapsack and went off to sleep. But an officer, Monsieur Favin, catching sight of me, pulled me by the ears and the hair. Others kicked me from behind, all without waking me. Several of them got hold of me and forced me to rise. And well for me that they did, or I should have slept the sleep of death. I felt very cross, however, at being roused. Many who we thought had perished came on from the Berezina. They embraced and congratulated each other as if it were the Rhine they had crossed, still 400 leagues off. They felt so happy that they were sorry for those left behind. They advised me to walk a little in front so that I should not fall asleep again. This advice I took. That concludes the 15th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.